I was fast asleep and was suddenly woken up by the sound of loud hums being broken by giggling. I looked over, and there's my husband in some kind of trance, humming and giggling in bed. I shake him, no response. I turn on the light, and he doesn't flinch but begins flapping his arms. He's not a drug user, but I had just gotten home the day before from a 2-week-long work trip and noticed he was acting really strangely, rhyming words when he talked, but now it honestly looked like he was high AF and was completely unresponsive. I call 911 and the paramedics come. Over that time, he slowly emerges from it and starts talking. His blood pressure is 180/120 while he's sitting quietly. He's a healthy guy in his 30s. They insist on taking him to the hospital. We spend several hours there, and over that time, he begins freaking out at me for calling 911. We're in Canada, so it's free. He takes off his wedding ring, throws it in the garbage, and tells me I'm a horrible person he never wants to see again. That's when the nurse sits me down and tells me what's going on. Bipolar disorder. He's in a deep mania and is psychotic. They involuntarily admit him, and he spends the next few weeks coming down from it. At that time, I grieved as if I had watched him die. Watching your partner go completely psychotic is so heartbreaking. They're just totally gone. Their bodies are there, but they are not. It took me a long time to recover. He's now, after 2 years, stabilized on the right medications. He's able to hold down a job. He's back to his whole self, and we've talked everything through. It's a cruel disease, but treatable. When I was 16, I hadn't heard from my dad in longer than usual and couldn't get a hold of him. Out of the blue, my uncle shows up telling my mom that my dad had a stroke and is in a coma. And since technically she's the closest next of kin, they were divorced, she needs to talk to my sister and me about making choices. Uncle was an old school Vietnam vet, so his weird and distant demeanor wasn't immediately raising red flags. Then my dad's former roommate and friend showed up hours later with similar but slightly different details, creepily hit on my mom, and started aggressively lecturing me about doing right by my dad and letting him go peacefully. Everything was full-blown chaos and very strange. I finally got to the hospital to see my dad, and he looks like he fell down a mosh pit and stayed there for hours, covered in bruises and cuts, fully intubated, swollen in parts of his head and face, just the works. Plus, it turns out he'd been there an effing week, and no one told us. Meanwhile, my uncle and aunts knew. When I started asking questions about his condition and such, I was told he fell down the stairs after he had had a stroke, called 911 and lost consciousness. Except no one had his phone. My sister and I go to his house and managed to get in, and it was awful. There were blood streaks and spatters all up and down the staircase. And at the bottom, human waste, where I'm guessing my dad was lying while or after getting beat, and footprints all over that were not his. The cops were completely uninterested in treating it like a crime scene or even taking statements. Useless cops. Shocking, I know. Long story short, after 3 months in a coma and almost a year of rehab, my dad is mostly functional and independent. He says he only remembers bits and pieces, and none of them make sense. His former roommate, whom he had apparently fallen out with, never showed up again. My uncle never explained the delay in telling us, and my dad's phone never turned up. While my dad was still in a coma, our house got broken into and absolutely ransacked, and there were some weird incidents with cars parked near our house or driving by a lot. We lived in a shitty neighborhood, so it might be unrelated, but it felt different. What effed me up most, though, on top of the awful scene at my dad's place, was the secrecy and sudden urgency that everyone had pushing to take him off life support. I've never been able to trust or even look at my family the same way. As a young child, I had a dentist who enjoyed it when children cried. It was normal to not have parents with you in the room with the dentist. My treatment was always under local anesthesia, and I remember that he liked to puncture the needle several times, in the tongue and other places in the oral cavity. If I cried, he would even tell me that no one would believe me. I never told anyone. He even told my parents once that I was moving too much, which is why I was bleeding so much on time. My parents didn't complain because he did a good job with his teeth. 30 years later, I still have scars in my mouth that I can feel with my tongue. I don't have to explain that I'm still afraid of the dentist today, do I? Becoming bedridden with a severe disability at 21. I used to be a bodybuilder and marathon runner. I was an attractive and adventurous young girl, top university student, and ready to start my career in accounting. One day, I started feeling incredibly ill due to a viral infection. It was awful. Every bone in my body ached, and I would yell out from my bed in pain over and over again for hours. It lasted 2 to 3 days. It turns out it was the Epstein-Barr virus reactivating. I never recovered. I now experience extreme body ache, severe nerve pain all over my body, and fatigue like no other. I leave my house maybe once a month for an hour max. Out of desperation, I've started an accounting business from my bed and have been able to supplement my disability payments. But it's not the same. It's been 5 to 6 years now. I cry regularly. I miss the outside world, and I've lost all my friends and can only see my partner of 8 years once a week. I'm only here for my dog, 15 years old, and my parents, 78 years old. After they go, I'll most likely take my own liking to join them. I am a prisoner in my home. There is nothing for me now. In kindergarten and in grade school, they would make us visit nursing homes. A lot of them had severe brain diseases. Their bodies were super deformed. It was often overcrowded and very dimly lit, and the smell was horrible. Sometimes they would scream or laugh like a witch, clap their hands, and whatever limited motion they had because of their deformities. Some were in a vegetative state, and some would grab you and not let go. I still haven't seen a horror movie that matches that level of horror. I would get physically ill whenever they had to use us to go there. My parents would have to literally pry me out of the car, and sometimes I would literally run away from school. In some ways, I felt like I snapped because I don't feel much. A couple of things were compounded. When I was about 12, my father set himself on fire because he was in extreme pain and depression. He had HIV, and my aunt didn't bring his medication back fast enough. I wasn't there when it happened, but the emotions hit hard. Treatment for HIV was just becoming available, but it was too late in his case, and he had no money to afford it. Then in my freshman year of college, my grandfather died due to a drawn-out mistreatment at the hospital that should have amounted to malpractice, and I was too poor to get home to attend his funeral, let alone help. Then that same year, my stepfather hung himself with razor wire and was decapitated. Again, he wasn't there when it happened. He had tried to cut his head off before and showed up to our house with stitches across his neck like Frankenstein. So I guess the signs were there. I think the powerlessness in these circumstances, coupled with imagery, is what haunts me. 18 years later, I now manage a land organization with white-collar colleagues and have no one to talk about it or who could relate to my past. Regardless of income or privilege, I will always feel like an outsider in my social and personal relationships. My brother died almost 2 years ago. The last day I spent with him was one of the best days of my life. The next day, he went out riding four-wheelers with his friends, flipped over, and was airlifted to a hospital 90 minutes away from where my parents lived. He wasn't wearing a helmet when we had told him time and time again to wear one. 9 days later, I held his hand and told him goodbye after my mom explained that he caught pneumonia, which basically put his body into shutdown. He was 20 years old when he died. He turned that age just 5 months after his last birthday, Way too young. I was 2 weeks from being 19. Now I'm almost 21, an age he'll never see. I get older while he has to stay young forever. I'll never get to see him get married and start a family, and he'll never get to see me do the same. Now I'll have to explain to the children I'll yet to have that their uncle is not alive, and how I'll basically have to pound the message of loving your siblings because you'll never know into their heads. And how do I now have to be overly protective of them when they want to go out on bicycles, four-wheelers, or anything that requires a helmet, and be made the bad mom because you never let me do anything I want to? All because he was taken too soon. I don't blame him for not wearing a helmet, or the hospital staff for not trying more with him as much as I want to. I only blame myself for not spending more time with him and taking him for granted a few times. I'm the youngest of the two kids. I hate being an only child. I was 25. The most beautiful person I've still ever met somehow decided to have dated and lived with me for 5 years. She's 23. She had a seizure and heart attack in bed next to me at 3 a.m., yelled out my name and passed away. It's been since 2009 and I'm still so lost and heartbroken. Corona couldn't figure out why. She'd never done any drugs. Sucks, man. It's gotten easier to a point where it's now plateaued. Pictures of her still give me butterflies. She was so sexy and cute, and the greatest, most giving person I've met by orders of magnitude. She worked in hospice as a home health aide just because she wanted to help people. I love you forever, Kristen Urquhart. There was this place on the river where a small bridge created a miniature pool. It was a paradise. One day we saw firefighter fast boats and an ambulance rushing along the river. They made us evacuate. It turns out a 17-year-old boy jumped from a car bridge just 1 kilometer back and into the river as a challenge. While he was struggling to get out, a 14-year-old girl saw him and tried to save him, but got stuck as well. Fortunately, a local canoeist was around, and he rushed toward the two. He only managed to save the girl. It was too late for the boy. A couple minutes later, while my dad was trying to get the car out of there, a helicopter came over and pulled the body up. I remember seeing the faces of the paramedics when they realized this. His mom arrived, and she couldn't tell what was going on since she was Arabic and didn't speak our language. Her face became bone white when a local managed to translate the only 2 words a mom would never want to hear. He's dead. It was hard to not remember what had happened when I came back a week later. When I was in my first year of nursing school, I had a part-time job waiting tables at a chain restaurant. One busy shift, I had a table of 12 fairly young women, all order hot water with lemon. And while I was serving them the hot water, one customer accidentally bumped me and I spilled my whole tray of hot water on this poor girl's back, burning her quite badly, and she needed to be taken away in an ambulance. The family tried suing me, but the restaurant chain legal team did a good job of protecting me and settling with the family. But I'm still pretty traumatized from that event, and I think about it often, almost a decade later. It was an honest accident, but I felt so effing bad to cause someone that much pain and probably permanent scarring. Death of my dad. I was 15. He fell out of bed one morning in the early hours, helped him back up into the bed. I thought nothing of it. Seemed okay at first. Fast forward a few hours later. I had stayed up from school that day. When I checked on him, he was severely lethargic. His lips were purplish color with white stuff around the edges, and his responses were nothing but gibberish. Being just a teenager, I had no idea what was going on here, but I knew it wasn't good. I desperately tried to get a hold of my mom at work for her to come over home. It was the longest 30 minutes of my life. When my mom got home, she called 911. Eventually, EMS took him out of the house to the local hospital where he only lasted 5 days. It turns out it was a heart attack, arterial sclerosis to be specific. Ever since then, life has not been easy. I have a lot of anxiety and grief that affect my relationship and my overall quality of life. It's hard to remove or move forward, even if it's been 15 years already. I'm 30. Sometimes I feel like I don't dwell on it much anymore, but its long lasting effects feel permanent. The most traumatic thing that I still have unresolved flashes of is that my father died of his cancer after 6 months when I was 11 years old. And just in the last 2 weeks, he went from looking kind of gaunt in his hospital bedgown to being thin as a twig, and I was 2 minutes away. And away 2 weeks prior to that day he would die. He had pleural effusion, which means that due to the metastasis in his lungs, the fluid was filling them up and making it impossible to breathe. So they started using tubes to dry it out, but cancer's cancer. So he only got worse. And then when my mom and me and my sister were told to go home from school on a Friday and Saturday night, my grandparents rushed us up to the hospital after my mom had called. I arrived and started crying the second I saw my dad because he looked like a fish washed up on the shore that was just breathing, like a dying animal. It took from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., and then in the middle of all of his breaths, he simply charted and immediately dropped, and I knew that was it. Around half of the extended family came up to us in the immediate hours afterwards, so there was no sense of shared experience at last. However, I was 11 years old, and it definitely was a big change in everything about life. I know I'm far from the only guy who lost on a bet when a parent at an equal and early age, though, but it's one of the things that still creeps up in memory from now and then. I never cry about it, but I do sometimes think about it.